I was standing at the bedroom door with divorce papers in my pocket, ready to end my marriage for my mistress. Then I heard my wife whisper 5 words that froze my blood. "I don't know, I'm dying." I thought I was about to be free. Instead, I realized I was about to become a widower. I spent the next month treating her like a queen, ending my affair, and falling back in love with a woman I thought was at death's door. But on the night I finally gathered the courage to say goodbye, I found out she wasn't sick. It was all a rehearsal. My wife isn't dying, but my secret affair is very much alive. Did I stumble into a second chance? Or am I trapped in a life I already tried to leave? If you believe some lies are worth keeping, hit the like button. I need you to be my jury on this one. Subscribe to see if I confess or keep playing the role. Share this with someone and ask, would you want to know the truth? Now, let me tell you how I became a better man for a tragedy that never existed. The air in the hallway felt thin, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the explosion I had carried home in my pocket. I remember the weight of that envelope so vividly. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was a lead brick pressing against my ribs, a physical manifestation of 10 years of shared history that I was about to incinerate. Those were the divorce papers, the cold, clinical, final nail in the coffin of a marriage that had become a ghost of its former self. We had grown silent, Sarah and I. Our conversations had devolved into logistical check-ins about groceries and bills, a rhythmic, hollow tapping on the walls of a room that had long since run out of light. I was done being the responsible husband, the one who stayed because it was the right thing to do, the one who performed the duties of a partner while his heart was miles away. I wanted the fire I found with Linda, the laughter that didn't feel like a chore, the touch that didn't feel like an obligation. I was ready to be the villain if it meant finally feeling alive again. I walked toward the bedroom door, my shoes sounding like a funeral march on the hardwood floor. In my head, I was rehearsing the speech. It was a masterpiece of redirection. I was going to tell her that we both deserved better, that the spark had died years ago, and that it was time to stop pretending. I was ready to step out of the shadows of my own guilt and into the sun, even if that sun was a bridge I had to burn behind me. I had practiced the tone. Firm but not cruel, distant enough to show I'd already left, but soft enough to avoid a scene. I just wanted it over with. I wanted to hand her the envelope, watch the realization settle into her eyes, and walk out into the cool night air where Linda was waiting for my call. But as my hand touched the brass knob, the metal felt unusually cold, sending a shiver up my arm that stopped me mid-breath. And then I heard it, a voice from inside. It was Sarah, but it wasn't the voice of the woman who had nagged me about the lawn or the woman who sighed when I came home late. It was soft, trembling. It was the sound of a person who had been hollowed out from the inside. She was talking to her best friend, Elena, and the words were so faint I had to lean my forehead against the wood of the door to catch them. "But I'm dying," she whispered. My heart didn't just stop. It turned to stone in my chest. The world tilted on its axis, the hallway blurring as the floor seemed to drop out from under my feet. I stood there, frozen, my fingers still curled around the knob, paralyzed by a sentence I was never meant to hear. "I don't even know how to tell him," she continued, her voice breaking on the last word, followed by a jagged, wet breath that sounded like a sob she was trying to swallow. "He's been so indifferent lately, so far away. The last thing I want is his pity, Elena. I can't stand the thought of him looking at me and seeing a burden instead of a wife." The divorce papers in my jacket pocket suddenly felt like they were glowing white-hot, burning a hole through the fabric and into my skin. Every word she spoke was a lash against my back. Indifferent, that was the word she used. She had felt my withdrawal. She had seen the shadow of Linda in my eyes even if she didn't know her name, and she was sitting in there, facing the end of her life, worried about being a burden to the man who was currently holding her exit strategy in his hands. "But you have to tell him," I heard Elena argue gently, her voice thick with a sympathy that made my stomach turn with self-loathing. "He's your husband, Sarah. He needs to be there." "Tell him what exactly?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the bitterness of despair creeping into her tone. "That I have cancer? That the doctor said I have just a few months to live?" Will it change anything? If he stays now, it'll only be because he's a good man who feels obligated to watch a tragedy. I don't want his obligation. I want the man I married back. But I think he's been gone for a long time. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Cancer. The word echoed in the hallway like a gunshot. My mind raced through the last few months, searching for the signs I had been too selfish to see. Had she been tired? Yes, but I thought she was just being lethargic. Had she lost weight? I'd barely looked at her long enough to notice. I had been so busy building a new world with Linda that I had completely ignored the fact that Sarah's world was collapsing. I wasn't a man looking for freedom anymore. The fire I thought I wanted with Linda was extinguished in a second, replaced by a cold, terrifying dread. I stood there on the threshold of our bedroom, the brass knob still in my hand, but I couldn't turn it. I couldn't walk in there and hand her those papers. How do you serve a death warrant to someone who is already dying? I realized in that moment that I was standing on the edge of an open grave, and I was the one holding the shovel. The responsible husband I had grown to hate was the only thing she had left, and the reckless man I had tried to become felt like a monster I didn't recognize. I stayed there for a long time, my forehead pressed against the door, the envelope in my pocket feeling like a heavy, shameful secret that I would now have to carry to the end. I wasn't going to Linda tonight. I wasn't going anywhere. I was staying right here in this hallway until I could figure out how to be the man she thought she had lost, even if it was for a tragedy I was never supposed to know about. I don't remember how long I stood in that hallway, my forehead pressed against the cold wood of the bedroom door, listening to the silence that followed Elena's departure. The house felt different now. No longer a cage I was desperate to escape, but a sanctuary that was crumbling into dust. When I finally found the strength to pull my hand away from the door handle, I felt the crinkle of the divorce papers in my pocket. They felt like a confession of a crime I hadn't yet committed. I moved to the bathroom, my movements mechanical and numb, and I stared at myself in the mirror. I looked for the man who was in love with Linda, but all I saw was a stranger with hollow eyes who had been planning to abandon a dying woman. I walked into the kitchen just as Sarah was pulling the plates from the cupboard. I stood in the doorway, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't see the woman who nagged me about the dishes or the woman whose presence felt like a weight on my chest. I saw a ghost. Now that the word cancer was ringing in my ears, the evidence was everywhere, screaming at me from the shadows I had chosen to ignore. She had grown thin, not the healthy, vibrant thin of someone taking care of themselves, but a sharp, brittle gauntness that made her clothes hang off her shoulders like they belonged to someone else. Her hair, which used to be a thick, chestnut curtain that I loved to run my hands through when we were first married, had lost its glow. It looked dry, lifeless, and thin. Her cheeks, once rosy and full of life, were now hollow pits, making her eyes look unnaturally large and filled with a weary, ancient sadness. She looked old. My wife, who was only 34, looked like she was 80. How had I not seen this? How had I been so blinded by the illicit thrill of my affair that I hadn't noticed my own wife was evaporating in front of me? "Oh, Mark, you're home early," she said, her voice small and careful. She didn't look at me directly. She never did anymore. She expected the usual grunt of acknowledgement, the sound of me walking past her to the office to call Linda in secret. "Yeah," I managed to say, the word catching in my throat like a shard of glass. "I thought I'd come home and help." She paused, a dinner plate frozen in midair. She turned her head slightly, squinting at me as if she were trying to see through a fog. "Help?" she repeated, the word sounding foreign on her tongue. "With dinner. With whatever you need," I said, stepping into the room. I took the plate from her hand. Her skin felt like parchment, dry and dangerously thin. I felt a jolt of electricity go through me, a mixture of terror and a sudden, fierce protectiveness that I thought had died years ago. That night, as she served dinner, a simple meal of pasta and salad, I sat across from her and watched her eat. She moved slowly, as if every lift of the fork required a massive expenditure of energy. She barely ate 3 bites before pushing the food around her plate. Every time she cleared her throat or took a shallow breath, My heart hammered against my ribs. Was she in pain right now? Was the disease clawing at her while she sat there in silence, trying to keep up the appearance of a normal Tuesday night for a husband she thought didn't care? The self-loathing was a physical weight. I thought about the text messages I had sent Linda that morning. I thought about the hotel room I had booked for next weekend. I thought about the way I had complained to Linda that Sarah was suffocating me. Suffocating. The irony was a bitter bile in my mouth. Sarah was the one who couldn't breathe, and I was the one holding the pillow. Right there, under the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of silverware, I made up my mind. The reckless version of me, the man who wanted to burn his life down for a new thrill, had to die. The divorce papers in my car would stay there until I could find a way to burn them. Sarah needed me. Whether it was for 3 months or 6 months, I was going to be the man she deserved. I wasn't going to give her pity. I knew she would hate that. I was going to give her the version of me she had fallen in love with before the world got cold. After dinner, she stood up to take the plates to the sink. She moved with a slight stagger, her hand reaching out to the table for support. Before she could grab the sponge, I was there. I reached over her shoulder and took it from her hand. "I'll do it," I said. My voice was firmer now, anchored by a new, desperate purpose. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with a confusion that broke my heart. "Mark, it's fine. I've got it. You usually have work to catch up on." "The work can wait," I insisted, gently nudging her away from the sink. "Go sit down. Read your book. I've got this." She stood there for a moment, her mouth slightly open, looking at me like I was a stranger who had just broken into her house. But then, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of relief crossed her face. Her shoulders dropped an inch. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." That night, for the first time in over a year, I didn't stay on my side of the bed. I didn't wait for her to fall asleep so I could scroll through photos of Linda. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of Sarah's breathing. It was ragged, punctuated by small, sharp gasps. I reached across the chasm of the mattress and found her hand. It was cold. She flinched at first, her fingers tensing under mine. It had been so long since I'd touched her with anything other than accidental contact. I didn't even know how to apologize for the years of neglect, for the affair, for the papers in my pocket. But I squeezed her hand gently, letting her know I was there. "I'm here, Sarah," I whispered into the darkness. "I'm not going anywhere." I heard her breath hitch, and for a second, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just let her hand go limp in mine, a quiet acceptance of a comfort she had long since stopped expecting. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, making a list of everything I needed to do. I had to call Linda. I had to delete the files. I had to find a way to make these next few months feel like a lifetime of love. I was a man standing on the edge of an open grave, but as I held my wife's hand, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I finally knew what truly mattered. The sun hadn't even begun to peek over the horizon when I crept out of bed, careful not to let the floorboards groan under my weight. I watched Sarah for a moment in the gray, pre-dawn light. She looked so small beneath the heavy duvet, her breathing still shallow and rhythmic, a fragile tether to a life that I believed was slipping away. Every second felt precious now, a grain of sand in an hourglass that was shattered at the base. I walked out to the driveway, the cold morning air biting at my skin, and sat in my car. I reached into the glove box and pulled out the divorce papers. I stared at them, the cold, legal language, the lines waiting for my signature, and then I did what I should have done weeks ago. I ripped them. I ripped them into tiny, jagged confetti until my fingers ached, stuffing the remains into a coffee cup to be trashed later. Then came the harder part. I took out my phone and dialed Linda's number. My heart was thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but it wasn't the excitement of an illicit call anymore. It was the heavy, leaden pulse of a man performing an execution. "Hey, stranger," Linda answered on the second ring, her voice honeyed and full of the playful flirtation that used to be my oxygen. "I was wondering when you'd call. Are we still on for the hotel this weekend? I bought that dress you liked." The sound of her voice made me feel physically ill. It was a reminder of the man I had been 48 hours ago. A man who was willing to trade his dying wife's dignity for a new dress and a temporary thrill. "Linda, listen to me," I said, my voice steady but cold. "It's over. All of it. Don't come to the office. Don't call this number. I'm blocking you as soon as I hang up." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. Then the honey turned to acid. "What? Mark, what are you talking about? We had a plan. You said you were serving the papers today. You said you couldn't breathe in that house anymore." "I was wrong," I said, and for the first time in a long time the words felt true. "The only thing I can't breathe without is my wife. Don't contact me again." I hung up before she could scream, before she could threaten, before she could pull me back into the web of lies. I blocked her number, deleted our message history, and wiped her existence from my digital life. I felt a strange, hollow lightness in my chest. It wasn't happiness, I didn't deserve happiness, but it was a sense of direction. I was no longer a man lost in the woods. I was a man on a mission. I walked back into the house and started on breakfast. I hadn't cooked a meal for Sarah in years. I used to complain that she didn't make the eggs exactly how I liked them, or that the coffee was too weak. Now, I moved with a desperate focus, whisking eggs, toasting bread, and brewing a pot of the expensive Kona coffee she loved but we rarely bought. I wanted the smell of it to fill the house, to be the first thing she woke up to. I wanted to replace the scent of medicine and despair with the scent of a home that was lived in. When Sarah finally emerged from the bedroom, she was wearing an old, oversized robe, her hand trailing along the wall for support. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, her eyes widening as they landed on the set table and the steaming plates. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice raspy from sleep. "What is all this? Did I forget what day it is? Is it an anniversary?" "No," I said, moving toward her and gently taking her arm to lead her to the chair. "It's just Tuesday. I just wanted to take care of you. Sit down, Sarah. Please." She sat, her movements hesitant and jerky. She looked at the plate like it was a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. "I'm not very hungry lately, Mark. You know that. Just try a little," I encouraged, sitting across from her. I didn't eat. I just watched her. I watched the way the steam from the coffee hit her face, bringing a ghost of color to her pale skin. "I'm driving you to work today, too, and I'll be there to pick you up at 5. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. She was waiting for the catch. She was waiting for me to ask for something, or for the other shoe to drop. She didn't believe in the change. She thought it was a performance. And the worst part was, in a way, she was right. It was a performance, but it was the most honest one I had ever given. The transformation didn't stop at breakfast. I became a man possessed by the need to serve. I spent my lunch breaks researching nutrition for cancer patients, buying supplements I hoped would help her energy, and scouting out quiet places we could go where she wouldn't have to walk too far. I became the perfect husband not because I was a saint, but because I was a man trying to outrun a debt that could never be paid. When I picked her up from work that afternoon, she looked exhausted, her frame practically disappearing into the car seat. "How was your day?" I asked, reaching over to turn up the heat so she wouldn't feel the chill. "Long," she sighed, leaning her head back and closing her eyes. "But Elena asked if you were okay. She said I looked different today, more supported." I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it felt like a physical wound. Supported. I had done the bare minimum for 12 hours, and it was already making waves in her world. How much had I taken from her by being indifferent for so long? "I'm more than okay, Sarah," I said, gripping the steering wheel. "I'm exactly where I need to be." That evening, the house was filled with a strange, fragile peace. I did the laundry. I cleaned the bathroom. I fixed the leaky faucet in the guest room that she'd been asking me to look at for months. Every task was a prayer, an apology in the form of labor. Sarah sat on the sofa, watching me move through the house, her book forgotten in her lap. She didn't nag. She didn't complain. She just watched, her large, hollow eyes following me with a mixture of wonder and wariness. I was building a heaven for her to die in. I was creating a world where she was loved, cherished, and seen, all while the secret of my discovery burned in the back of my throat. I couldn't bring myself to tell her I knew. I couldn't bear to see the look of pity or the realization that my love was born from a tragedy. I wanted her to believe I had just woken up. I wanted her to believe that the man she married had finally come home. As the weeks began to pass, the routine solidified. I took her shopping, letting her lean on my arm as we wandered through boutiques. We went to the beach at sunset, sitting on a blanket and watching the waves, the salt air masking the scent of the illness I was sure was lurking beneath the surface. I took her to the cinema, making sure we had the aisle seats so she didn't have to climb over anyone. And the strangest thing happened. The glow slowly started to come back to her cheeks. She laughed more. She seemed to stand a little straighter. I told myself it was the rally, that final surge of energy people get before the end. It made me work even harder. It made me love her even more fiercely. I had become the responsible one, the anchor, the husband I should have been for the last decade. But as I watched her thrive in the light of my devotion, I realized I was also a man living on borrowed time, waiting for the day the play would end and the curtain would fall on the woman I had finally learned how to love. The weeks that followed were a blur of bittersweet perfection, a period of time I can only describe as a false heaven. It was a reality constructed out of equal parts devotion and desperation. Because I believed Sarah's time was finite, that every sunset we watched was one closer to the final darkness. I lived every second with an intensity one had never known. The indifferent husband was dead and buried. In his place was a man who hung on her every word, who anticipated her every need before she even realized she had one. The strangest thing began to happen during this period. The more I acted the part of the man who loved her, the more I actually became him again. The resentment I had felt for years, the boredom that had driven me into Linda's arms, the constant friction of our differing personalities. It all evaporated. When you believe someone is dying, the way they leave their shoes in the middle of the hallway or the way they tell the same story 3 times doesn't irritate you anymore. It becomes a precious detail you want to etch into your memory forever. I found myself memorizing the way the light hit the golden flecks in her eyes and the specific, melodic cadence of her laugh. I was falling in love with a woman I was already mourning, and that paradox created a passion that was more intense than anything I had ever felt with Linda. To my surprise, and my secret terror, Sarah seemed to be thriving under this new regime of care. The gaunt, skeletal look that had horrified me that first night began to soften. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, and the sallow, grayish tint to her skin was replaced by a genuine, healthy glow. She was eating more, actually asking for second helpings of the healthy meals I prepared, and her energy levels seemed to skyrocket. We went to the beach, and instead of just sitting on the blanket, she wanted to walk along the shoreline, her hand tucked firmly into mine, her feet splashing in the cold surf. "I feel like a different person, Mark," she said one evening as we sat in the cinema, waiting for the lights to dim. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a brittle collection of bones. She felt solid. She felt alive. "I don't know what happened to us, but I feel like I've been given a second chance at life." I squeezed her hand, my throat tight with a mixture of joy and agonizing guilt. I told myself this was the rally, the medical phenomenon where a patient experienced a sudden, dramatic improvement before the final decline. I had read about it late at night while she slept. It was a cruel trick of the body, a final surge of adrenaline and spirit before the end. Knowing this made me double my efforts. I took her shopping for dresses she would likely never wear to a second season. I planned weekend getaways to mountain cabins, driving 4 hours just so she could breathe the crisp pine air. I was trying to cram 40 years of marriage into a few months. The nagging that had once defined our relationship stopped completely. She no longer questioned where I was or why I was late, because I was never late. I was always there. The house, once a battlefield of silent treatments and sharp remarks, became a sanctuary of soft music, shared laughter, and a profound, quiet intimacy. We talked more in those few weeks than we had in the previous 5 years. We talked about our childhoods, our dreams that we'd set aside, and the things we were grateful for. But we never talked about the cancer, That was the heavy, unspoken weight that anchored our heaven to the earth. I lived in constant fear of the day the rally would end. Every time she coughed, my heart skipped a beat. Every time she stayed in bed 20 minutes longer than usual, I would hover by the door, listening for the sound of her breathing, terrified that the darkness had finally arrived to claim her. I was a man living in a beautiful house built on a foundation of quicksand. The internal struggle was becoming a physical ache. I wanted to tell her I knew. I wanted to tell her that I was sorry, not just for the affair, but for the years I had wasted being a mediocre husband. I wanted to confess that the divorce papers had existed, and that the man who wanted to leave her was a monster I had successfully executed. But I couldn't. To tell her I knew about the cancer would be to admit I had been eavesdropping. It would bring the medical reality into our false heaven and shatter the magic. I wanted her to believe I was doing all of this simply because I loved her, not because I was a man trying to buy his way out of purgatory. I also lived in fear of Linda. I had blocked her, but I knew she was a woman who didn't take rejection lightly. Every time a car slowed down in front of our house, or every time the doorbell rang unexpectedly, a jolt of pure adrenaline would hit my system. I was terrified she would show up and scream the truth, destroying the peace I had worked so hard to build for Sarah's final days. I was guarding a fortress on two fronts, the illness from within and the betrayal from without. One night, after a particularly beautiful day spent at a botanical garden, Sarah fell asleep on the sofa, her head in my lap. I ran my fingers through her hair, which was starting to feel thick and soft again. I looked at her, and the thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. I can't lose her. The responsible man I had become didn't just want to serve her. He wanted to keep her. The thought of the house without her voice, the bed without her warmth, was a darkness I couldn't contemplate. I realized then that my penance had turned into a genuine, desperate need. I wasn't just being a good man anymore. I was a man fighting for the only thing that made his life worth living. As I sat there in the dim light of the living room, watching the rise and fall of her chest, I made a decision. I was going to ask her about it. No more secrets. No more false heaven. I was going to tell her I knew she was sick, and that we were going to find the best doctors, the best treatments, and that I would spend every cent we had to fight for her. I was ready to face the truth together, no matter how ugly or painful it was. I didn't want to just give her a beautiful end. I wanted to fight for a new beginning. But fate, as it turns out, has a very sick sense of humor. Just as I gathered the courage to wake her and start the most difficult conversation of my life, the doorbell rang. It was Elena, and in the next 10 minutes, the false heaven I had built would come crashing down around me. Not because of a death, but because of a script. The doorbell didn't just ring. It sounded like a funeral knell, a sharp, intrusive vibration that cut through the fragile peace of our living room. Sarah stirred in my lap, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. A gesture so youthful and healthy it should have been my first clue. I smoothed her hair one last time, my heart swelling with a protective resolve. I was ready. I was going to face the cancer with her. I was going to be the hero of a tragedy that was finally moving into its final act of honesty. I opened the door to find Elena standing there, holding a stack of stapled papers and a travel mug. She looked energized, her eyes bright with a professional spark I hadn't seen during her previous, somber visits. She barely acknowledged me, slipping past into the warm light of the foyer. "Sarah, tell me you've been practicing. We only have 4 days until the showcase, and the director is already breathing down my neck about the pacing of the third act." Sarah stood up from the sofa, stretching her limbs with a grace that felt like a slap in my face. "I've been working on it, Elena. Honestly, I think I've finally found the core of the character. The desperation, the way she hides the truth from her husband. It's starting to feel real, almost too real." I stood by the door, my hand still resting on the wood, feeling a strange, cold prickle begin at the base of my neck. Character? Director? Third act? The words swirled around me like a flock of disoriented birds. I walked slowly into the living room, my legs feeling heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. "The third act?" I asked, my voice sounding distant, like it belonged to someone else in a different room. Elena turned to me, beaming. "Oh, Mark, you haven't seen her rehearsing? She's incredible. The community theater drama presentation, The Silent Goodbye. Sarah is playing the lead, a woman who discovers she's terminally ill but decides to keep it a secret to give her husband one last perfect month. It's heart-wrenching. Truly. The way she delivered that line through the bedroom door a few weeks ago, I was in tears, Mark. I told her right then, if she can capture that kind of raw emotion on opening night, there won't be a dry eye in the house." The world didn't just stop. It inverted. I felt the floorboards beneath my feet turn into ice. I looked at Sarah, who was suddenly blushing, a look of modest pride on her face. The cancer, the dying, the just a few months to live. It wasn't a diagnosis. It was a script. It was a collection of lines written by a playwright, practiced by my wife, and overheard by a man who was so blinded by his own guilt that he had mistaken a rehearsal for a death sentence. You're doing a play," I whispered. "I told you about the drama club at work months ago." "Mark," Sarah said, walking over to me, her eyes filled with a soft, affectionate concern. "But I guess you were so busy with the new accounts that it just didn't sink in. I didn't want to bother you with the details, especially since I was so nervous about being the lead. Elena's been helping me run lines every Tuesday and Thursday." I sat down on the edge of the sofa, my head in my hands. The false heaven I had built over the last month wasn't built on quicksand. It was built on nothing but air. The $400 I'd spent on organic supplements, the hours of research on oncologists, the thousands of dollars in shopping trips and mountain retreats, it was all for a role. But then, the true weight of the situation hit me. I looked up at Sarah. She looked better than she had in years. She looked loved. She looked cherished. And she looked at me with a devotion that was absolutely terrifying. Because the perfect husband who had saved her world wasn't real. He was a man who only showed up because he thought she was leaving. He was a man who had ended an affair not out of moral clarity, but out of a sense of duty to a ghost. And there, in the quiet of our living room, with Elena flipping through her script and Sarah smiling at me, I faced the ultimate moral dilemma of my life. Linda was still out there. The divorce papers were shredded, but the intent behind them was still a part of my history. If I told Sarah the truth, if I laughed and said, "Oh, what a funny misunderstanding. I thought you were actually dying," the house of cards would collapse. She would realize that my sudden transformation was a fraud. She would realize that I had only loved her because I pitied her. She would ask herself, if I'm not dying, does he still want me? And the honest answer, the one that lived in the dark corners of my heart, was a question I wasn't ready to answer. I looked at Sarah. She was the woman I had fallen back in love with, but I had fallen in love with her under false pretenses. I had become a better man for a tragedy that never existed. If I confessed, I would lose the woman who was finally happy. If I stayed silent, I would be a man living a lie for the rest of my life, forever playing the role of the perfect husband for an audience of one. "Mark," Sarah asked, kneeling beside me, her hand warm on my knee. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I looked into her eyes, clear, bright, and full of a future I had almost thrown away. I had a choice. I could be honest and destroy her, or I could be a liar and keep her. I could open the door to the truth and let the cold wind of our past blow everything away, or I could keep the fire burning on the hearth of a beautiful, perfect lie. "I'm fine," I said, my voice steadying as I made the most reckless and responsible decision of my life. I reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the same way I had practiced when I thought her time was short. "I'm just so proud of you, Sarah. I can't wait to see the play." I was standing on the edge of an open grave, all right, but it wasn't Sarah's. It was mine. And as I smiled at her, I realized that I was going to spend the rest of my life making sure she never, ever found out that the man she loved was just an actor who had forgotten his lines. The blue light of my phone screen felt like a laser cutting through the darkness of the hallway. I sat there on the floor, my back against the cold drywall, watching the dots on the screen as Linda typed, stopped, and typed again. The false heaven hadn't just collapsed. It had turned into a prison. I was a man who had successfully performed a miracle, only to realize the miracle was a mistake. I sat in that stunned silence for what felt like hours. The sounds of Sarah and Elena's laughter in the living room muffled by the heavy door. They were celebrating a successful rehearsal, but I was mourning the death of my reality. My mind was a chaotic storm of what-ifs. What if I had served the papers 30 days ago? I would be with Linda right now, free of this house, free of this crushing weight. But then I looked at the hallway. The walls I had freshly painted because I thought she deserved a beautiful space to spend her final months. I looked at my hands, which were calloused from the chores I had taken over. The cancer was gone. The death sentence was a script. But the changes in me, they felt permanent. I had become a version of myself I actually liked. The kind of man who brewed coffee just because he knew his wife liked the smell, the kind of man who listened instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. But the foundation of that man was a lie. I was a beautiful building constructed on a swamp of deception. I wasn't a hero. I was just a man who had been scared into being decent. A soft knock on the door made me jump, the phone nearly slipping from my sweaty palms. It was Sarah. "Mark, are you okay in there? Elena's leaving. She wanted to say goodbye." I stood up, smoothing my shirt, trying to wipe the look of sheer terror from my face. I stepped out into the light, and there she was. My wife, the woman who wasn't dying. She looked radiant. The glow I thought was a medical anomaly was actually just the result of being loved. It turns out that when a person is cherished, when they aren't being cheated on and ignored, they tend to look a lot better. "I'm fine," I said, the lie coming easier now. "Just a bit of a headache. I think I've been working too hard." Elena waved from the front door. "Don't work him too hard, Sarah. He needs to be in the front row on opening night. I'm telling you, Mark, your wife is a star." She captured the tragedy of that character so perfectly. It's like she really knew what it felt like to be losing everything. I forced a smile that felt like it was made of cracking glass. "She's a natural," I managed to say. Once the door closed and we were alone, the silence of the house changed. It wasn't the fragile, precious silence of a hospice. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a marriage. Sarah walked over to me and wrapped her arms around my waist, leaning her head against my chest. This was the woman I had been treating like a saint for 30 days. "You've been so different lately, Mark," she whispered. "I was so scared we were over. I felt you slipping away months ago. I thought you had someone else. I even thought about asking for a divorce myself. But then it was like you just woke up. You became the man I married again. You saved me, Mark. You saved us." I held her, but my eyes were fixed on the phone sitting on the hallway table. "You saved me." The words were a bitter poison. I hadn't saved her. I had saved a ghost. I had fallen back in love with a woman I thought I was losing. But now that she was staying, I had to figure out if I still wanted her. Or rather, I had to figure out if I could live with the version of me that she loved. The responsible one in me, the man who spent the last month doing the right thing, wanted to stay in this warm, loving embrace. He wanted the quiet nights and the shared breakfasts. But the reckless one, the man who still had Linda's burner number burned into his brain, felt like he was being buried alive. I was a man who had accidentally built his own cage, and I had used the finest materials to make sure the bars were unbreakable. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message. I knew without looking it was Linda. She had been quiet for a few days, but the silence was over. "I know you're not at a business retreat, Mark. I saw your car at the cinema. I saw you holding her hand. You have 24 hours to meet me, or I'm coming to your front door with the receipts. Don't play with me." The ghost of Linda had officially clawed its way out of the grave. I looked down at Sarah's head, resting so peacefully against my heart. She was so happy. She was finally truly happy. If I told her the truth, that I only stayed because I thought she was a terminal patient, I would destroy her more effectively than any cancer ever could. I would be telling her that her husband's love was a pity prize. I would be telling her that the last month of heaven was just a well-funded apology for a betrayal she didn't even know happened. But if I stayed silent, I would have to find a way to silence Linda. I would have to become a different kind of reckless. I would have to live a double life that was even more complicated than the affair itself. I would be a man who was perfect at home and a blackmailed wreck everywhere else. I pulled back from the hug, my hands trembling. I have to go out for a bit, Sarah. I forgot I promised to drop off some files at the office. She looked up at me, the smile faltering just a fraction. On a Sunday night? Mark, you've been working so hard lately. Can't it wait until morning? No, I said, reaching for my keys with a desperation I couldn't hide. It's important. It's about a final deadline. I won't be long. I promise. I walked out of the house and into the cool night air, the same air I had expected to breathe as a free man a month ago. I sat in my car and stared at the dashboard. The divorce papers were gone, shredded and tossed in a bin at a gas station 3 towns over. My mistress was a ticking time bomb. My wife was a healthy woman who believed she had lived through a miracle. And I was the actor who had forgotten that the play was supposed to end. I realized then that the weight of the verdict wasn't something you felt once. It was a weight you carried every time you looked the person you loved in the eye and kept a secret. I had to decide right there, in the dark of my driveway, if the lie was worth the life it had created. Was a marriage built on a beautiful deception better than a truth that would leave us both in the ruins? I put the car in reverse, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I wasn't going to the office. I was going to meet Linda. And as I drove away from the house where my dying wife was waiting for me, I realized that I had finally become the most responsible man I could be. I was going to do whatever it took to make sure the lie never died. The neon sign of the roadside diner flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing hum, casting a sickly yellow glow over the hood of my car. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white as bone. This was the intersection where my 2 lives were about to collide. On one side was the house I just left, the warm, soft-lit sanctuary where Sarah was probably humming one of her play's melodies, believing she was the luckiest woman on earth. On the other side was this diner, where Linda sat in a corner booth, holding the matches she intended to use to burn that sanctuary to the ground. I stepped out of the car, and the night air felt like a wet shroud. I walked into the diner, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful sound that felt like a mockery. Linda was exactly where she said she'd be. She looked beautiful in a way that used to make my heart race, but now just made my stomach churn. She had that sharp, polished edge, the perfect hair, the expensive coat, the calculated smirk of a woman who knew she held all the high cards. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Mark," she said, not even looking up from her coffee as I slid into the booth across from her. Or maybe just a man who's realized he can't run as fast as he thought he could. "What do you want, Linda?" I asked. I didn't want the small talk. I didn't want to see the way her eyes lit up at my discomfort. I just wanted the price. "I want the truth," she snapped, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "I spent 6 months listening to you moan about how stifled you were. I spent 6 months being the woman you ran to. We had a plan, Mark. You were supposed to be free. And then suddenly you ghost me? You turn into Mr. Domestic? I saw you at the beach. I saw the way you were looking at her. That wasn't pity, Mark. That was love. So tell me, did you find a magic wand? Or were you lying to me the whole time?" I looked at her, and for a second, I thought about telling her the truth. I thought about saying I thought she was dying. I thought about explaining the drama rehearsal, the misunderstanding, and the way the fear of loss had rewired my brain. But I realized that to Linda, that would just be another weapon. She didn't want my tragedy. She wanted my compliance. "It doesn't matter why," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the vinyl booth. "What matters is that it's over. I'm staying with Sarah. I want to make it work." Linda laughed, a sharp, cold sound that drew looks from the 2 truckers at the counter. "Make it work? With what? A foundation of lies? Do you think she'd still look at you like that if she knew about the hotel in Jersey? If she saw the pictures you sent me? If she knew you were holding her hand while planning to hand her a divorce decree?" She leaned across the table, her perfume, the scent I used to love, now smelling like funeral flowers. I'm not going to be the secret you just get to delete, Mark. I'm not a file on your hard drive. How much? I whispered. The responsible one in me was horrified, but the reckless one knew this was the only way to keep the lights on in Sarah's new world. How much to walk away, to delete the messages, to forget my name, to never show up at that house. Linda's expression shifted. The anger didn't leave her eyes, but a cold, calculating greed settled over her features. She named a number. It was a staggering amount. Nearly everything I had stashed away in my private savings. The money I had been putting aside for my new life. It was the price of my silence. The ransom for Sarah's happiness. That's everything, I said. Consider it an exit tax, she replied, sliding a small USB drive across the table. Everything is on here. The photos, the logs, the receipts. You pay me, I give you the password. You don't, and I hit send to Sarah's email, her mother's phone, and your boss's LinkedIn. You decide what your perfect life is worth. I took the drive. It felt heavy like the divorce papers had. I realized then that the price of keeping a secret isn't just the money. It's the way it changes your soul. I was no longer a man who had made a mistake and was trying to fix it. I was a man who was buying his way out of a disaster. I was becoming a criminal to protect a saint. I walked out of that diner feeling like I had just sold a piece of myself that I could never buy back. I drove home in a daze, the USB drive burning a hole in my pocket. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Sarah through the living room window. She was practicing her lines again, moving with a fluid, healthy energy. She looked so innocent, so blissfully unaware that her husband was currently negotiating with the devil to keep her world from spinning out of control. I walked into the house, and she ran to me, wrapping her arms around my neck. "You were gone longer than I thought," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that felt like a hot iron against my skin. "Is the work done? Is the deadline over?" "Yeah," I said, burying my face in her hair so she couldn't see the tears in my eyes. "The deadline is over. Everything is taken care of." But as I held her, I realized that the price of the lie was higher than the money Linda wanted. The price was that I could never truly be the man Sarah thought I was. I would always be the man with the USB drive in his pocket. I would always be the man who was one password away from total destruction. I had saved her from the truth, but in doing so, I had locked myself in a room where the only company I had was my own guilt. I had become the most responsible man in the world. I was carrying the weight of a marriage, a mistress, and a massive lie all on my own. I was the anchor, but I was also the one who was sinking. And as I looked at the healthy, glowing woman in my arms, I wondered how long I could keep treading water before the weight finally pulled us both under. The following weeks were a slow-motion collapse. On the surface, I was the paragon of a husband, the kind of man people whispered about at dinner parties with a mix of envy and awe. I brought Sarah flowers for no reason. I remembered the obscure details of her co-workers' lives. I rubbed her feet after her long rehearsals. But inside, I was a hollowed-out shell, vibrating with a high-frequency anxiety that threatened to shake my teeth loose. Every time Sarah looked at me with those wide, trusting eyes, I felt like a fraud standing on a stage, waiting for the audience to realize I had forgotten the play entirely. The psychological erosion started with the phone. It became a weapon. Every vibration in my pocket felt like an electric shock. Every time the screen lit up, my stomach performed a sickening somersault. Linda didn't just take the money. She took my peace. She knew she owned me, and she enjoyed the intermittent reinforcement of her power. She would send cryptic texts at 2 a.m., just a single period or a photo of the restaurant where we used to meet. No words, just a reminder. I am still here. I am the shadow in your peripheral vision. I stopped sleeping. I would lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to Sarah's rhythmic, healthy breathing. It was the sound of a life I had bought with blood money. I began to obsess over the what-ifs. What if Sarah found the USB drive? I had hidden it inside a hollowed-out book in the back of my office, but I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced she was in there right now, turning the pages. What if Linda decided the money wasn't enough? What if she wanted to see the look on Sarah's face more than she wanted a stable bank account? The pressure manifested in physical ways I couldn't hide. My hands developed a slight, persistent tremor that I tried to pass off as too much caffeine. I lost weight, ironically the same way Sarah had when I thought she was dying. I looked haggard, my skin sallow and my eyes bloodshot. "Mark, you're working yourself to death," Sarah said one evening, her voice laced with that terrifying, genuine concern. She reached out to touch my face, and I almost flinched. Her touch, once my greatest comfort, now felt like an indictment. "You did all this for me. The trips, the care, the support. But you're falling apart. Please take a break. The play opens in 2 days. I want you to be there, healthy and happy." "I'll be there," I rasped, my voice sounding like it was being pulled through gravel. I'm just tired, Sarah. It's a big project at the firm." The lie was a living thing now. It had its own geography, its own history, its own rules. I had to remember which lies I'd told to Linda and which ones I'd told to Sarah. I was an architect of a labyrinth, and I was starting to forget where I'd placed the exits. The irony was suffocating. I had treated Sarah like she was dying to make her feel alive, and now that she was vibrant and thriving, I felt like I was the one walking toward the grave. I began to resent her health. It was a monstrous thought, one that made me want to scrub my soul with lye. But it was there. If she were actually sick, this would have an end date. There would be a conclusion to the play. But she was healthy. She could live for another 50 years. And that meant 50 years of looking her in the eye and seeing the man she thought I was, while knowing the man I actually was. It meant 50 years of paying Linda's exit tax. It meant 50 years of being an actor who couldn't leave the stage. The responsible one in me was screaming for a way out. He wanted to go to Sarah, fall on his knees, and confess everything. "I was leaving you. I had an affair. I only stayed because I thought you were terminal." He wanted the relief of the truth, even if that truth burnt the house to the ground. He wanted to stop being a hero and start being a human, even a broken one, but the reckless one. The one who had already paid the bribe, shredded the papers, and built this false heaven was terrified. He knew that if the truth came out, Sarah wouldn't just be heartbroken. She would be humiliated. Every beautiful memory from the last month would be retroactively poisoned. Every kiss would become a pity check. Every "I love you" would become a forged signature. To tell her the truth now wasn't an act of honesty. It was an act of cruelty. It was a way to offload my guilt onto her shoulders, and I couldn't do that. Not to her. The night before the play opened, I reached my breaking point. Linda sent a photo of Sarah's office building. No text, just the photo. I went into the bathroom and threw up until there was nothing left but yellow bile. I sat on the cold tile floor, gasping for air, feeling the walls closing in. I realized then that I wasn't saving Sarah. I was just delaying the inevitable. I was a man standing on a crack in the earth, trying to hold the two sides together with his bare hands. When I finally walked back into the bedroom, Sarah was asleep. She looked so peaceful, so completely convinced of her own safety. I stood over her, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I felt a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. Why did she have to do that drama presentation? Why did she have to be such a good actress? Why did she have to make me believe the lie? The rage passed as quickly as it came, leaving me feeling hollow and ashamed. It wasn't her fault. It was mine. I was the one who listened at the door. I was the one who had the affair. I was the one who decided to play God with her emotions. I lay down beside her, but I didn't touch her. Couldn't. I was a black hole of secrets, and I didn't want to pull her into the darkness. I lay there until the sun began to bleed through the curtains, realizing that tomorrow was opening night. Tomorrow she would stand on that stage and play a woman who was dying, and I would sit in the front row and play a man who was happy. The play was finally beginning, but as I looked at the ceiling, I realized that for me, the curtain would never actually fall. The community center theater smelled of floor wax, dusty velvet, and the nervous sweat of amateur actors. I took my seat in the front row, The center seat I had reserved weeks ago when I still thought I was buying a ticket to a memorial. My suit felt too tight, the collar of my shirt a noose that tightened every time I swallowed. In my pocket, the USB drive from Linda felt like a jagged stone. She hadn't texted since the photo of Sarah's office, a silence that was louder than any threat. I felt her presence in the room, though I didn't dare turn around to look. She was the shadow in the back row, the ghost at the feast, waiting for the precisely perfect moment to scream. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird, battering itself against my ribs. When the curtain rose, the stage was set to look like a bedroom, eerily similar to our own. And then Sarah walked out. She didn't look like the vibrant, glowing woman who had hugged me this morning. She had used makeup to hollow out her eyes and pale her skin. She wore a thin, silk robe that billowed around her like smoke. She was the ghost I had seen that first night. The audience let out a collective, soft gasp. She looked fragile. She looked like a tragedy waiting to happen. The play began, and I watched my life replayed as a fiction. Sarah's character stood at a door, her hand trembling on the knob, delivering a monologue to the empty room. She spoke about the secret she was carrying, the tumor that was a silent thief in her blood. She spoke about her husband, how he was a good man who had lost his way, and how she wanted to give him one last perfect month so that his final memory of her wouldn't be one of hospitals and tubes, but of light and laughter. "I will be the lie he needs," she whispered to the audience, her voice cracking with a precision that was haunting. "I will be the beautiful ending to his mediocre story, because if he knows the truth, he will only stay out of duty. And I want him to stay out of love, even if that love is a ghost I've summoned from the dark." I felt the air leave my lungs. Every word was a mirror. Every line was a scalpel. I sat there, paralyzed, realizing that the dilemma of the play was exactly the dilemma of my life. She was playing a woman lying for love, while I was a man lying for survival. The audience was weeping around me, moved by the noble sacrifice of the character. They saw it as an act of supreme selflessness. But sitting there, knowing the rot in my own pockets, I saw it for what it was. A beautiful gilded cage. The irony was a physical pain. I had spent the last month treating her like a saint because I thought she was this character. I had ended my affair, spent my savings, and rewired my entire soul to match the good man she was describing on stage. But as I watched her, I realized that the good man didn't exist. He was a creation of her script and my misunderstanding. Then came the scene that broke me. The husband character entered the stage. He was played by a young man with a kind, open face. He brought her flowers. He told her he loved her. He promised to be better. And Sarah, as the character, smiled at him with a look of such pure, heartbreaking gratitude. The exact look she had given me every morning for the last month. The audience sobbed. They saw a beautiful reconciliation. But I saw the horror. I saw the husband being manipulated into a version of himself he didn't choose. I saw the wife trapped in a performance she couldn't stop. I saw two people who were no longer human beings to each other, but merely roles in a play they were both too afraid to end. I felt a vibration in my pocket. Linda. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew the ultimatum had arrived. The 24 hours were up. I looked up at Sarah on the stage. She was in the middle of her final monologue, the silent goodbye. She was talking about how the lie had actually made their love real again. "The truth would have killed us both," she said, tears streaming down her pale makeup. "But the lie gave us a second chance." In that moment, a terrifying clarity washed over me. I realized that Sarah didn't just play this role. She understood it. And if she understood it, then she already knew. The thought hit me like a lightning strike. The rehearsal at the door that first night, was it really just a rehearsal? Or had she seen the divorce papers in my car days before? Had she known I was leaving, and used her acting skills to craft a dying persona to pull me back? Had she been the one manipulating the responsible one all along? I looked at her eyes on stage. For a split second, I felt like she looked directly at me, through the fourth wall, through the darkness of the theater, and into the very center of my secret. There was no pity in that look. There was only a fierce, desperate survival. The play ended. The curtain fell. The audience erupted into a standing ovation, a thunderous roar of approval for the beautiful tragedy. I stood up with them, my hands clapping mechanically, my mind a fractured mess of suspicions and guilt. I went backstage. The air was thick with the smell of hairspray and adrenaline. I found Sarah surrounded by flowers and well-wishers. When she saw me, she broke away from the crowd and ran into my arms. She smelled like stage makeup and victory. "Did you see it, Mark?" she whispered, her face glowing beneath the theatrical paleness. "Did you see what a second chance looks like?" "I saw it," I said, my voice a ghost of itself. As I held her, I felt the USB drive against my hip. I felt the weight of Linda's threat in the air. I looked at my wife, the star of the show, and I realized that I would never know the truth. I would never know if she was a victim of my misunderstanding or the architect of my entrapment. And it didn't matter. We were both actors now. We were both committed to the script. We were both standing on the edge of an open grave, holding hands, and pretending the sun was rising. I leaned in and kissed her. A kiss that was a promise and a lie all at once. I had made my choice. I was going to be the perfect husband. I was going to pay Linda. I was going to burn the drive. I was going to live the play until the real end came. Because in a world where the truth is a death sentence, the lie is the only thing that keeps you alive. I am sitting in my car now, the engine idling in the driveway of the home I spent the last month trying to save. The headlights are cut, leaving me in a darkness that feels thick and suffocating. Behind me, through the living room window, I can see the warm, golden glow of the lamp. I can see Sarah's silhouette as she moves across the room, probably hanging up her costume, still humming the final melody of a play that moved 1,000 people to tears. She thinks the performance is over. She thinks the curtain has stayed down. But for me, the stage lights are blinding, and I am the only one left who hasn't taken a bow. In my lap lies the USB drive, a small silver piece of plastic that holds the digital remains of the man I used to be. Every photo of Linda, every text message where I complained about my boring life, every hotel receipt. It's all there. A ticking time bomb that is one password away from total annihilation. And in my hand, I hold my phone. Linda's final message is glowing on the screen. 5 minutes, Mark. 5 minutes until I send the opening night gift to your wife. I realized tonight, watching that play, that the truth isn't always a light that sets you free. Sometimes, the truth is a forest fire that burns everything in its path, leaving nothing but ash and bone. If I walk into that house right now and tell Sarah the truth, what am I actually doing? I would be telling a woman who feels loved and cherished that she was actually a pity project. I would be telling a woman who is proud of her second chance that it was built on a foundation of betrayal and a pathetic misunderstanding. I would be freeing my conscience by shattering her heart. But if I keep the lie, if I pay Linda the ransom, burn the drive, and spend the next 30 years pretending I never wanted to leave, then I am a prisoner of my own making. I will spend every anniversary, every birthday, every quiet Sunday morning looking into her eyes and knowing that she is in love with a ghost. I will be the responsible one on the outside, but a hollowed-out fraud on the inside. I will be a man who saved his marriage by losing his soul. The irony is that the lie has made us better. That is the most terrifying part of this whole ordeal. In trying to give a dying woman a perfect end, I actually gave a living woman a perfect marriage. We are kinder to each other. We listen more. We are more present. The lie acted like a medicine, curing a sickness in our relationship that I thought was terminal. Can a beautiful life built on a lie ever be considered real? Or is the deception so deep that the love itself is a forgery? I look at the house and then I look at the phone. I am the jury now, but the verdict is too heavy for one man to carry. I invited you into this hallway, I showed you the divorce papers in my pocket, and I let you hear the rehearsal through the door. You've seen the reckless man I was and the responsible man I tried to become. You saw me fall in love with a tragedy and find myself trapped by a comedy. Linda is at the end of the street. I can see her headlights. The 5 minutes are up. I have two choices. First choice, the cold truth. I open the door, I show Sarah the phone, I show her the drive, and I tell her everything. I tell her I thought she was dying, and I tell her about Linda. I let the marriage burn, hoping that maybe, just maybe, something honest can be built from the ruins. I stop the play and let the lights come up on the ugly, unscripted reality of who we are. Second choice, the perfect lie. I pay Linda. I delete the evidence. I walk inside and I kiss my wife, and I never, ever mention the word cancer or Linda again. I spend the rest of my life playing the part of the husband she deserves, even if it's a role I only learned because of a mistake. I keep the secret to protect her happiness, even if it means I never get to be truly seen again. Which man would you rather live with? The one who destroys everything to be honest, or the one who sacrifices his truth to keep the peace? The headlights are getting closer. I have to make the call. I'm stepping out of the car now, walking toward the front door. The weight of the envelope is gone, but the weight of the verdict is just beginning. What would you do? Would you save the woman, or would you save the truth? I'm reading your comments before I turn the key. Tell me, am I a hero for staying, or a coward for not leaving? The jury is in session. What is your verdict?